There's something slightly strange that happens at a certain level of success. It doesn't really announce itself. There's no moment where things suddenly feel wrong. In fact, on the surface, everything tends to look right. You've built something that works, something stable, something that from the outside would probably look like the goal. And yet, internally, it doesn't always feel like freedom. It feels like something else, something a bit harder to define. And I think most people don't talk about this honestly enough because it sounds ungrateful or irrational or like you're meant to be more appreciative of what you've created. But the experience is still the experience. And if you pay attention to it closely enough, there's usually a pattern. Life hasn't necessarily become easier, it's become more structured, more full, more complex. And complexity is interesting because it doesn't always feel like pressure at first. It feels like progress, it feels like growth, it feels like things are moving in the right direction. But over time, complexity starts to take up space, not just externally, internally too. And what I mean by this is quite simple. There are more decisions to make, more things to hold in your mind, more responsibilities sitting in the background of your awareness. And even when you're not actively working, part of your system is still managing all of that. So you might sit down in the evening or take time away and try to step back for a moment, but that something is still slightly engaged. Not in an obvious way, just enough that you don't fully drop into where you are. And that's where the shift needs to happen, because freedom isn't just about what you can step away from externally. It's also about what your system is still holding on to internally. Because the difficult part is this: the very pattern that helped you build your success are often the same patterns that make it hard to experience it fully. Let that land for a moment. Because if you look at most high-functioning people, there's a shared trait, a kind of internal vigilance, a tendency to stay slightly ahead of things, to anticipate, to manage, to keep things contained. And that works incredibly well when you're building something. It creates consistency, it reduces risk, it keeps things moving. But the nervous system doesn't automatically switch that off just because the environment changes. It keeps running the same baseline because that's what it has learned. That's what it has adapted to over the years. So even when life becomes more successful, internally it can still feel like you're operating in the same model you were when you were building it. And that's where people often get confused, because externally they're moving forward, but internally they haven't really updated the operating system. And what I mean by that is not a metaphor, it's quite literal in a biological sense. Your nervous system learns patterns through repetition, through reinforcement, through survival relevance. If something helped you stay organised, effective, or ahead of problems, it gets encoded as useful. And then it tends to repeat, even when it's no longer strictly necessary. So you end up in a situation where your external life has evolved, but your internal baseline hasn't quite caught up. And that creates a very specific kind of friction. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just persistent. A sense that you're always slightly on, even when nothing is actually required of you in that present moment. And over time, that can start to reshape how life feels, because you stop fully arriving in experiences. You start slightly managing them instead. You stop fully resting, and you start supervising rest. You stop being in your life altogether and start overseeing it. And I want to be careful here, because this isn't framed as something wrong with you. It's actually the opposite. It's a system that has done exactly what it was supposed to do. It has kept you effective. It's kept you stable. It's kept things working. But what once created success doesn't always create ease. And there's a very subtle difference between the two. Because success often requires control, but freedom requires release. And those two don't always coexist naturally in the same internal configuration. So what tends to happen is this: you keep the success structure and then you try to put relaxation on top of it, but it doesn't quite land because underneath the system it's still structured around responsibility. So even when you're trying to switch off, a part of you is still in charge of things. And that's why true rest can feel slightly out of reach, not because you don't know how to rest, but because something in you doesn't fully believe it's safe to fully stop what you've been doing. And that's the deeper layer most people never really look at. It's not time management, it's not stress management, it's not even mindset. It's the underlying structure of how your system has learned to stay safe through control, anticipation, and responsibility. And until that structure changes, the experience of freedom stays slightly out of reach. Now, I want to leave you with something to reflect on, because this is usually where things begin to shift for people. Not when they try to do less, but when they start to notice what part of them is still doing more, even when nothing requires it. That's where the real work begins. And in the next video, I'm going to go into why the same system doesn't just create stress, but also makes it difficult to ever fully switch off, even when everything is technically fine. Because that's where most people get stuck, not in crisis, but in function. And that's a very different problem to solve. If you want me to break this down in more detail and show you how this pattern actually forms and how to start shifting it at the level underneath thought, click the link underneath this video. That's where I go deeper into this and explain how to start working with the system directly rather than against it.